Starr Forum, hosted by MIT's Center for International Studies. My name is David Andrew Singer. I'm an associate professor here at MIT in political science. Before I introduce the speakers, I just wanted to say a little bit about the forum of this event. We're going to start with Professor James Galbraith speaking about his book. We'll have discussion comments by Rachel Wellhausen. And then we will open up the floor to Q&A. And again, during Q&A, we ask that you come forward and use the microphones that are available on the floor. So first of all, we're very happy to have Professor James K. Galbraith here with us today. He's the Lloyd M. Bentsen Jr Chair in Government Business Relations and Professor of Government at the University of Texas at Austin. Galbraith is also a senior scholar of the Levy Economics Institute and chair of the Board of Economists for Peace and Security, a global professional network. He also writes a column for Mother Jones and occasional commentary in many other publications, including the Texas Observer, the American Prospect, and The Nation. Galbraith's new book, which he'll be talking about today, is Inequality and Instability, a study of the world economy just before the crisis. His other books include The Predator State, How Conservatives Abandon the Free Market and Why Liberals Should Too, Balancing Acts, Technology Financing the American Future, and Created Unequal, The Crisis in American Pay. He's also co-edited a number of books and authored 2 textbooks. So we're very pleased to have him today. We're going to ask him to speak for approximately 20 minutes, and then we'll move to discussion and Q&A. Thanks.
That works. Thank you very much, Professor Singer, soon to be Professor Wellhausen, soon to be my colleague at the University of Texas. It's a great pleasure to be here. On a day when the election results in France and Greece call attention to a changing popular mood, at least in some parts of the world, after 4 years of an unresolved economic crisis. I'm certainly very pleased to be here at MIT to talk about a book that studies some of the issues that I think are relevant to the onset of the events with which we've been faced in recent years. And it's certainly a pleasure to be back in Cambridge, which, as many of you know, is my hometown. The study of economic inequality has been a coming thing in economics only for the last decade and a half or so. It was a backwater for many years following the end of World War II for the first half of the post-war period, and only began to catch the interest of the economics profession in the 1980s when it became clear that things were changing, that there were developments of interest, that in particular respects, inequality, especially in the United States, was getting worse. Over the years since, and particularly in the 1990s, there developed a dominant narrative on this subject in which the classical economic notions of supply and demand tended to predominate. That is to say, there developed in the literature an explanation of inequality that was based upon technology and the demand for skill, education and the supply of skill, immigration and trade and the supply of unskilled labor, contending forces operating in the labor market, but operating in ways that economists understood to be substantially microeconomic, market-driven in character. This suggested that the environment in which these forces were operating was substantially self-contained labor markets, which might be linked to each other, but only by the kinds of channels I just described, by the diffusion of technology, by the migration of workers, by trade in goods with differing compositions in the labor that puts them together. If you went to the Journal of Economic Literature, and in fact if you go there today and ask how you would be able to classify an article on macroeconomics and inequality, you'd find there's no such classification. That, in fact, the profession is simply not oriented to thinking about the problem of inequality in those terms. This is something I have been engaged in trying to change for quite a long time. I did a book called Created Unequal, Crisis in American Pay, in 1998, which reviewed this literature, particularly focusing on the United States, and came to the conclusion that the narrative framework was not adequate to describe what was actually happening, and that one needed to have a much clearer picture of how inequality, movement of inequality, fit into the ongoing evolution of economic conditions. This book, Inequality and Instability, extends that work to the world at large. And it does so in the first instance, as the earlier work also attempted to do, by building on a very substantial project of the collection of information, of data, of measurement of inequality and the movement of inequality around the world. So I begin the book with a little quotation from a Cambridge, Massachusetts philosopher, as it happens, about the proper role of information gathering at the root of this kind of project of inquiry. I was not the first, obviously, to realize that in order to understand something about the movement of inequality in the world economy, you had to have good information on it. Very capable people had done a great deal of interesting and important work in this area, particularly in the 1990s, when at the World Bank and later at WIDER in Helsinki, the World Institute for Development Economics Research, scholars had assembled the mass of measurements, survey measurements of inequality that had been done in the world up to that point. The problem with the work was not in the collection of the data, but in the fact that the original source data simply wasn't rich enough to give a reliable picture of what is going on. And that was for two reasons. One is that surveys are expensive, and they were in many places quite rare, so that long periods might pass, years upon years, in which a survey of adequately high quality was not taken in many countries around the world. And secondly, where surveys did exist, the object being surveyed was often quite heterogeneous. That is to say, sometimes the surveys were of income, sometimes of expenditure. Where you were looking at an income concept, the concepts were not consistent from place to place. Not the fault of anybody working in this area, but a problem for scholars attempting to work with the resulting data collections. And one of the consequences of that was that the literature built upon this work was quite indefinite in what it seemed to show. In particular, one of the great original insights of development economics research, that of Simon Kuznets, relating inequality to income level as the development process progressed, faded from view. And I actually have a wonderful short exchange of correspondence with Paul Samuelson late in his life when talking about Kuznets, in which he wrote to me that in his view, Kuznets was right until he wasn't right anymore. And that was Paul's view, and it was a perfectly reasonable view based upon the evidence as he had seen it. There was also a great deal of literature which I think was inspired in part by the let's say, Rorschach test quality of the, Rorschach blot quality of the information relating inequality to economic growth. Was a low degree of inequality conducive to a more rapid rate of growth, or was a higher degree of inequality fostering savings and investment the better wellspring of stronger economic performance? This kind of thing became a staple of the economic research. What we did was to find sources of information which had not been tapped to provide measurements of inequality, and those sources of information turned out to be very extensive and to be very easily drawn on as a body of, let's say, source data from which measures of inequality can be calculated. I won't go into the technical details here. They're readily available, and I can certainly explain them if anybody is asking. However, I will just talk very briefly about what we found at the world level and then a little bit at the national level. At the world level, it turns out that this work, my work, strongly validates Simon Kuznetz's core insights, which is that the driving force behind economic inequality is intersectoral transitions in the process of economic development and change, and in particular, the changing patterns of industrial development, changing patterns of the role of finance. Here is a stylization of that argument, which holds, as Kuznets did, that if you are in the initial phases of economic development, that is to say, moving from agriculture to industry, inequality is likely to rise as income rises, because you have the differential between the city and the countryside, between the factory and the farm. That differential tends to moderate and decline in the process of industrialization as it deepens, because the agricultural sector becomes less significant in the economy, and because you have ongoing processes of the growth of democracy, unionization, social democracy in the process of urbanization and development. And that story still seems to be substantially true. But we also found that for the very richest countries, of which the United States is a prominent example, countries which are supplying advanced technological goods and financial services to the world economy, a period of strong economic growth raises the income levels at the top. And so you have a relationship in which, as income continues to grow rapidly, inequality actually gets more extreme in countries like the United States. And to put in a nutshell, in a very stylized fashion, the argument that I make in the opening part of this book, in the 1980s and in the 1990s, one had broadly the following phenomenon. At the low end of this scale in China, income was growing rapidly, inequality was growing rapidly. At the high end of the scale at various times, we had strong growth of income, particularly in the US in the late 1990s, as a result of the credit and equity-driven boom in finance. Income inequality grew rapidly. But for much of the world, because of the debt crises, because of the stress of high resource costs and low commodity prices for those who were exporters, things went backwards. And if the model is correct, you would expect inequality to rise there as well. And that's what our evidence shows. So you have, it's kind of a bit too simple, but still an explanation for rising inequality under these conditions in the entire world. A second point is that this curve is not necessarily stable. It does, in fact, shift, and the shift has a common pattern in the world economy. And we can extract that pattern from the data set, from the information we have, in a very simple way. That is, if you look, this is from something called a two-way fixed effects model of a panel data set using the time effects as a time series to show the common pattern of the movement of inequality in the world economy over the period from the early 60s to the early 2000s. And what you can see is that there is initially a fairly stable period, comes to an end in 1971. a short period of declining inequality between 1971 and 1980, which coincides with commodities boom and a debt-driven expansion in some parts of the world, and then a turnaround and a massive worldwide increase in economic inequality that peaks in 2000. Right? This is the period that George Soros refers to as the super bubble, and I would also call it a super crisis for much of the poorer population of the world. It's interesting that this measure of inequality coincides almost exactly with an entirely separate set of measures, which are Branko Milanović's so-called Concept 1, inequality measured between countries on an unweighted basis. And it's also the same pattern that you find if you take the profit share in the OECD countries. They all have the same turning point and the same pattern of increase from 1980 to 2000. So this suggests that the movement of inequality is not something which is idiosyncratic, dependent upon the policies of individual countries, except in some cases where countries truly did isolate themselves from the world, but rather part of a common global process which was, I suggest, driven mainly by changes in the financial regime. That is to say, from early 60s to 1971, you're under Bretton Woods. After that, you're essentially in a credit boom, and then you are in a massive credit bust, which rolls around the world, Latin America, then to Central Europe, Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, and finally to Asia in the 1990s. And that is a massive period of rising inequality, which again, as I say, peaks so far as we can tell in 2000. I do have data on what happens over the period from 2000 up to nearly the present in the United States, and what we find is that there is a kind of sawtooth pattern in the US after that. I'll come back to that momentarily. The ability to measure inequality in a lot of different countries in a fairly thoroughgoing way, inequality of incomes, inequality of pay and wage structures, depending upon what your data source may be, enabled me and my mostly student associates who did a great deal of this work to do a study of a number of important economic relationships and to call into question, in certain ways, some other aspects of the economic orthodoxies of the time. One of which, as I think everybody knows, particularly Europeans, has been the claim that the United States holds an advantage in employment over Europe because we have more flexible labor markets, and the claim that Europe suffers from chronically high unemployment because of its commitment to egalitarian wage structures. That is a proposition that depends entirely upon the frame within which you are making the comparison. It turns out, however, that the data do not support it at all. We looked at inequality in relation to employment inside Europe, and we find that there's a very stable systematic relationship in which countries with more egalitarian wage structures have, in fact, lower unemployment rates, better employment performance than the countries with more unequal wage structures. And there's very good, I think, reasons, even in conventional economic theory, why one might expect that to be true. People who are in unequal situations tend to leave the bad jobs to look for the good jobs, and they're unemployed in the meantime. And it's also true, this is the insight behind the Scandinavian model, that countries which have maintained reasonably compressed wage structures tend to attract better industries, and so their productivity and their income levels rise over time. It's also, however, not true, as has been often claimed, that the wage structure in the United States is radically more unequal than it is in Europe. And the reason that finding comes into question is that those measurements have always overlooked, for Europe, the differences that exist between countries, which are very large. If you treat Europe as a single unified continent, the way a multinational investor would, or a portfolio investor would, you find that the inequalities that exist between Poland and Germany, or between, let's say, Norway and Spain, are very, very substantial. And when you calculate those into the mix, they're actually larger than those that exist in the United States. So again, the ability to look at this problem with fresh eyes and with fresh information sets of various kinds gives us the capacity to say, I think, some very interesting things about the world. Coming back to the United States, and I know my colleagues are political scientists, I want to just say very briefly some things about the relationship between inequality and political outcomes. Here I'm conscious that we're sort of moving into a territory which has about which a great deal has been written, but it still seemed to us to be interesting to look at, in particular, inequality in American states and whether there was any systematic relationship with political outcomes. And we found the following things, which I think are certainly worthy of reflection. One is it does appear to be quite systematic that American states which have higher degrees of income inequality have lower voter turnouts. Not a surprising finding. You might expect that in that situation, the rich would be more anxious to suppress the votes of the poor. And if you live in the American South, as I do, it's not exactly out of line with historical experience. We also find, and more interesting, perhaps more subtle and maybe more debatable proposition, that we're able to at least maybe cast some light on a very interesting paradox in the political science literature, namely the finding that while rich people tend to vote Republican, rich states tend to vote Democratic, the so-called Gelman paradox. And one of the things that we're able to do is to ask whether we could explain the relationship that Gelman and his associates found on that. And it does turn out that if you measure inequality in a spatial sense, looking at where people live, not just the differences of income, but how they are located across states, states where the rich and the poor are more spatially separated tend to have less of a relationship between income and voting patterns than others. So that's, again, an interesting phenomenon where the inequality measurements appear to cast some light on some interesting phenomenon in social science. Here is, by the way of summing up, a little indication of how to understand income inequality measured in tax data in the United States. The inequality measure in this case, which tracks very closely all the standard measures, is taken by measuring inequality across counties. The other line is the log of the NASDAQ stock market index rising to a peak and then an abrupt fall after 2000. And you can see that the inequality measure and the stock market measure follow each other very precisely. Not only do they peak at the same time, they also rise and fall by the same proportionate amounts. For a very obvious reason, inequality in the United States, measured by tax data, is strongly reflective of the incomes of those at the highest part of the income spectrum, and those incomes tend to be heavily dominated by stock options realizations, capital gains, and incomes paid to company executives out of the proceeds of IPOs in this period. And so you're looking at essentially two measures of exactly the same phenomenon. And you can verify this, and I can't unfortunately show it on this computer, but if you take out just a handful of counties, if you take out just New York County, New York State, the measure of inequality rises considerably less. If you take out just 5 counties, New York, plus 3 in Northern California, Silicon Valley, San Francisco, Santa Clara, and San Mateo, plus King County, Washington, Seattle, about half of the increase in inequality in the 1990s actually just goes away. So you're looking at something which in the United States represents incomes that were extraordinarily spatially concentrated for the obvious reason that the companies that were achieving the highest income gains for their executives were either the banks doing the financing or the Silicon Valley tech firms that were receiving the money. And if one updates the same analysis, here I will just skip over that, to the late 2000s. This is a map that's just been produced that shows the movement of inequality across, or the contribution of individual counties to inequality in the United States. You can see that once again, of course, the financial center in the late 2000s extraordinarily important, but now there are hotspots, important centers of high incomes in South Florida and Southern California, in other places which are clearly reflective of the housing boom and of the lending against housing, which was, of course, the source of the debacle that led to the meltdown in 2007, 2008. So what I would say, just by way of conclusion, is that the work that I've done in this book, I think tells us that inequality and economic instability are essentially two sides of the same phenomenon. That when you see one, you're seeing a representation of the other. And that this is perhaps the single most important reason that I, at least as an economist, can bring to a policy discussion of this issue to suggest it's something that we should be much more concerned about than we have been. Because we're living in a period in which we find that the instability and the consequences of tolerating that sort of instability for very large parts of the population here and around the world are very, very serious indeed, and are likely to lead to political, economic, and social upheaval if we don't deal with them adequately going forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now we're going to switch to discussion comments by Rachel Wellhausen, soon to be Dr. Rachel Wellhausen. She's finishing her PhD here in the Political Science Department at MIT, and she's a specialist in international political economy in all of its facets, but has special expertise in the relationship between governments and multinational corporations, in particular in Eastern Europe and other emerging markets. So we're going to pass it over to Rachel for comments, and then we'll invite your questions. Let me just say that copies of Professor Galbraith's book will be available for purchase outside after the forum. So, Rachel, please.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the very interesting presentation. And the book just has so much in it. It's very rich and grappling with so many different questions. I would highly recommend it. I thought maybe I'd start by just praising you and saying thank you for the data collection effort that you put together, not only collecting the data, but applying a relatively straightforward metric to find entirely new sources of inequality measures that are useful in all kinds of research agendas. And what's particularly important about using geographic variables to calculate inequality it allows us to identify the important role that geography and place can have in identifying what we even mean by the concept of inequality, in addition to understanding what inequality might mean for outcomes of interest. Assembling all of this data also allows for very good retellings of economic histories. In the book, you find a summary of Cuba's economic history, Argentina and Brazil, with very interesting ways to relate not only economic growth, but the relative movement of different groups in society via these measures of relative wages across sectors and geographic regions. And with this data, again, it's just a new way to approach what might be a topic that you think you already had some thoughts about. So the data, the kind of main application in the book is to use these data to trace inequality since the 1980s in countries around the world. And there's this consistent and strong correlation between measures of economic inequality and measures of financialization. And by financialization, I mean this relative growth of the financial sector, relative growth of sectors that use say, venture capital, so sectors that are directly benefited by the financial sector, like high tech, and then these stock market measures. And so with this evidence, with this correlation in hand, the book takes on three huge topics at once. This idea of financialization, the idea of inequality, and economic instability. And the way I parsed it, at least, was that the argument really is that financialization is making up the largest share of inequality. And it is through in this way that inequality is leading to crisis. If we could draw a kind of diagram, it would be that financialization is pointing to inequality, which is pointing to crisis. Although in the text, sometimes these factors kind of melt into each other. So to make this argument that there exists this chain, we need to do two things, I think. First, we need to know that financialization does indeed make up a very important part of what we know of inequality. And I'll give a few comments, concerns I have on this point. And then secondly, we need to know that inequality in and of itself has some kind of direct effect on crisis and instability. That is, why add inequality to this chain? Why not focus on financial sector issues and then that directly lead into crisis? So I'll give a few comments on this point, but then kind of highlight all of the other research questions to which these data are applicable. So is financialization really key to inequality? Is that key to the movements in inequality over time, especially in recent decades? Well, academic literatures provide a set of determinants that are linked to inequality and are causally linked to inequality. And I don't see these considered in the book necessarily. For example, the size of the public sector in a country, or unemployment, inherited wealth, the partisan balance of power, unionization, redistributive and welfare policies. All of these kinds of factors that could be operating on a state level or a local level, or an individual level, or even a regional level, all kinds of different levels. There are lots of factors out there that really can go to help explain the existence of inequality and changes in inequality. And in the book, the assertion is made that, quote, common and financial factors explain a very large share, practically everything that can be explained, end quote, about inequality. But my concern is that without addressing these other determinants in the analyses, we just can't convincingly cut out the role of local or state level policies in determining these changes that have happened over time, or the possibility that macroeconomic phenomena might be operating through local and state level policies. Without going into too much detail, the idea of a worldwide relationship between financialization and inequality is a little tricky because of the statistical methods used in the book. While the hypothesis indeed seems plausible, again, without considering these other factors, I'm not sufficiently convinced that all of the other explanations for inequality aren't playing a role as well. So by mentioning inequality in the context of financialization and crisis, we're providing a very important service, I think, to the economics discipline and to the kind of public sphere to emphasize inequality as a light post that one should pay attention to, and as a potential indicator to pay attention to if we're thinking about financial crisis, what might be happening in the future. And I'd really like to see how well inequality how useful inequality is as a predictor or a lamppost in other historical periods or in other locations in the world. But I would kind of challenge that maybe we need not insert inequality into this chain from financialization to crisis. If we leave out inequality, I think we can tell a narrative about how the recent, we and many commentators have told narratives about how the recent financial crisis came to be and other crises throughout history. What adding inequality to the story does do is again provide this kind of beacon that allows us to pay attention to a distributional measure in society that would be linked to what might be otherwise difficult to see economic outcomes. The book, as I mentioned, takes bites into many different research questions. And the work on Kuznets in particular is fascinating. And indeed, there are many research agendas for which this measure will be useful. The general issue with the book's empirical chapters, however, is that the models used to estimate the effect of inequality on different outcomes of interest are somewhat simplified. And this leaves the reader unsure as to wonder whether it is inequality that is actually doing the work in the arguments presented, or whether it's something else. And therefore, while there are provocative preliminary findings in the book and provocative hypotheses, we're not left with enough data to be sure if they're supported or not. In the chapters on American politics, the models of vote choice and voter turnout could, for example, use some more variables, say, from the latest research in the field. And a very interesting chapter looks at whether democracies are more or less equal than other types of government regimes. And while this is an important and much studied question, the statistical approach doesn't deal with the problem that it could be that inequality outcomes are a result of the government regime, or the government regime is causing inequality outcomes. So without this kind of sorting out which way the arrows are going, if you will, then we're really unable to kind of find a convincing story from these analyses. Pointing out the different wage differentials between European countries and US states is very important, and indeed is one of the reasons that kind of commentators on the Eurozone kind of point out there's some differences among these countries that are hypothetically supposed to be part of the same unit. But again, the argument that labor market flexibility is not related to unemployment, again, is a bit unconvincing because of these underspecification of the models, some unconventional methods, and kind of an unclear role of what role other forces in the international economy play, like international trade, for example, interacting with currency appreciation and depreciation. So just to conclude then, the data put together that form the backbone of this book and that the research team has very wonderfully made available online are very important and really will make a major contribution in encouraging more researchers to consider the role of inequality in their questions and to actually measure it. And so this means fewer problems of too few variables for all the rest of us trying to do analyses in political science and economics. So while the book itself in some of its analyses faces these problems of doing not quite enough to really put the meat on the bones of the answer, if you will, it's really providing a service to the rest of the field that's just fantastic. And pursuing this link between inequality and instability over longer time periods, in fuller model specifications, and with regard to more kinds of instances of financial crisis in history, may indeed really shed important light on what exactly it is that inequality can add to our understanding of financialization and crisis.
Great. Thank you very much, Rachel. Professor, would you like to respond to anything that she said?
There are a couple of points on which I could say a few words. One of them concerns, well, I guess there are three issues. One is simplification. The second one is the role of local and national policy factors in determining what happens to the inequality measures. And the third is this question of causality. I'll just say a word about each of them. On simplification, I plead no contest. In a work of this kind, which is intrinsically based primarily on the accretion of new information sources, it would be extraordinarily ambitious to try and do the definitive statistical work on the application of that material, and that's not something that I set out to do. And I'm sure that having tossed out some hypotheses about political outcomes, for example, that others can take that up and make of it anything that they can. I'll mount a stronger defense on the question of state and local, the relationship between international and global, and the state and the local. I think that the fact that there are strong regional and common global movements in the data tells you something very definite that one is not going to learn by running country-specific models. It tells you that forces are at work that affect neighboring countries in similar ways and at similar times. Forces that are at work that affect countries which are in a certain relationship to the world economy in one way, let's say debtors or oil consumers, and the other one force that affect countries in the opposite relation, producers and creditors, in a different way. This is very useful information which emerges from the examination of a global data set. The fact that there are common forces that are pushing up inequality around the world does not necessarily exclude the presence of local forces. And in fact, when you look at the data and try to sort of measure the effects over time, you find that there are significant exceptions to the pattern of global pressure. Notoriously, China and India do not experience rapidly rising inequality with the onset of the debt crisis. They were insulated from the debt crisis. They do experience it later on in the 1990s, but this is clearly a sign that what we're talking about is the global pressure of those events on countries that were exposed to commercial bank credit and to the collapse of lending. I'll just add to that countries with strong institutions that were, at least in some cases, able to withstand these pressures, so that local influences do matter, but that they are influences which are strongly impacted by what's happening to them from the outside. The other observation about that, you quoted about a comment about how much of the pressure on inequality can be attributed to the global factors. And the passage you were quoting was referring to actually a calculation which showed that if you take out the time effects, basically the whole of the rise of inequality goes away. So it is just to give you a sense of how much of the trend that one observes is in fact common. Well, it is common, and that's a statistical, to some degree, a statistical truism, but it is showing that things are moving in a very common way around the world. Final point, which has to do with the question of causality. I try, and I don't claim to have been completely successful in the drafting, to be cautious about making causal claims. Inequality, after all, is a statistical concept. It's a measurement concept. It's something that you calculate from a body of data. And then to turn around and attribute to it a causal role in human society strikes me as a risky thing to do. What I'm trying to do in the book is to show the relationship of this measured outcome to the larger forces that are visible and observable at the time. And in that sense, it seems to me very clear that that financialization, the rise of the financial sector around the world, the rise of the dependence of the world economy on the private extension of credit, on the swings of the global financial sector, the evidence for that is very clear, very strong. So again, I try to be cautious about attributing inequality per se as a causal force, because then you need a real model of understanding how exactly that works. And people have tried to come up with such models, but that's not the exercise that I'm engaged in here.
Okay, thank you. We welcome your questions. If you have a question, if you would please come to the front to one of the two microphones and you can ask your question. And let me remind you that your goal is to ask a question rather than to make a speech.
rather than to go on at length. I'm Jean Gilman. I'm from the Security Studies program in the Center for International Studies. And I think I have a question really about the events in France. So I'd love to hear your comment on that. But the context in which I'm interested in, your responses reflect my interest, have to do with this issue of the local response. And it's a big question, but I would love maybe in another forum to know where you situate your work relative, for example, to Amartya Sen on inequality and his descriptions of what people do with inequality, and whether France in some way gives you an example of how people deal with that particular question. So I'm particularly interested in France. You could do, I think, Greece as well on this, but I do think that it would be so wonderful if you could go to the future with this, and that would be my question.
Okay, so the outcome of the elections in the last,
That's right.
in the last
Hollande,
24 hours.
Yeah. Not to put pressure on you.
Yeah, no. Let's talk about Greece first, because I think what we're observing in Greece is the disintegration of a political society. Greece is a country which is being steadily destroyed. It did not have strong social institutions before, and it was patched together by a number of expedients after the end of the colonel's rule in the early 1970s. But what it had is being taken apart systematically. I was in Athens in October, and if you get told by people, if you go to the public hospitals, you'll leave in a box. It's a situation in which weak institutions are stressed by budget cuts to an extreme degree, and they're practically, so far as people there observe them, no longer functioning. This is a very serious situation because it's a travesty for the promise of Europe. It is saying that essentially that the European system does not care enough, is more intent upon preserving the political coalition in Germany than it is in the human consequences of what's going on in Greece and some other of the peripheral countries as well. That, I think, is the outcome of the election, shows that. The established parties, the coalition parties, were reduced to the point where Mr. Sampras of New Democracy said today that he cannot form a government, and passed the baton to the head of one of the new rising left parties, who probably will not be able to form a government either, so then we'll see what happens. In France, obviously a society which is still much more coherent and has also, as the Greeks do, a strong tradition of political discourse and resistance. I think you have a repudiation of a government that was too complacent in its willingness to go along with to be part of let's say, a European leadership whose focus was very heavily on stabilizing its banking system at the expense of everything else. And that we'll see. I don't think that François Hollande has extraordinary running room, or that necessarily he would take it even if he does. But he is now in the position where he is, I think, basically expected to start raising questions about the strategy. And he will now become the principal partner of Angela Merkel in deciding what the European policy is going to be. And this is going to be a very interesting problem for Mrs. Merkel. She's not had the same kind of challenge that he might be able to give her. And that it's clear at least parts of the European electorate are expecting him to. The French electorate, but also you think about what's happened in Holland, where the government fell over this issue just recently. So things are moving. Things are changing. And I think it's quite, it's interesting. It's potentially exciting. Still, one has not to be too carried away because the possibilities are not that great.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. I guess my question in a way builds on that question and on a couple of comments that each of you made. And it has to do with the extent to which there are countries, nations, states that have not been as heavily, have not experienced the same degree of impact of inequality. And the obvious people always think of Sweden or Denmark, or on one of your graphs, Denmark appears as being relatively equal. So, again, what are the opportunities for countries that may have some growth and may prosper to a degree, but are still able to mitigate the impacts of financialization with a variety of policies, which is what's being contested now politically in Greece and France? Is there there is no alternative, Tina, or is there an alternative? And basically, is there a link between is there a way to have political equality in the face of the pressures for income inequality? It seems like in the United States we have both. We have tremendous income inequality and very little access to the political system for people who don't have money. And so it's an acceleration, intensification of the inequality processes. But are there countries where political equality is maintained and people make choices about how much inequality to allow? So on sort of the correlation between political inequality and income inequality.
Yeah. Well, the correlation of the relationship is very direct and was expressed in my favorite sentence in The Wealth of Nations is perhaps the shortest sentence in the book. Adam Smith writes, "Wealth is power, as Mr. Hobbes says," which I always love. It's a casual reference. But is it possible to have a public politics that isn't run out of the pockets of the financial sector? I think the answer to that is yes, it's possible. You have to have institutions. There's an old Galbraithian term called countervailing power that provide countervailing power. Trade unions historically, the public sector, the scientific and engineering community all need to play a stronger and stabilizing role. You can have, or at least up till now, it has been possible for 20 years or so to have episodes of strong economic growth driven by banks and by the financial markets generally, but they always end badly. And the last one ended especially badly because it was fundamentally run on a deeply corrupt basis. It was fundamentally run on the basis of mortgages that the issuers knew would not be repaid, would have to be renegotiated, or would default. And they have, of course, been defaulting massively, and people are being foreclosed on massively. And you see a very long period before we work our way out of that, if indeed ever we do. The small countries of Northern Europe are, I think, they're plausible examples, although Sweden has experienced rising inequality in recent years. They are also small. And so one has to be careful about using them too extensively as models for the United States. And I try to be restrained about that. A country which is much larger, which has been moving toward, has been deepening its democracy over time, and reducing poverty and inequality is Brazil. We can see that very clearly over the last 12 years now through 3 presidential administrations. And I think that's a very promising sign that if one is persistent and gradual and you develop stronger education, healthcare, housing, that you can have both social progress and political progress. Argentina also has not done too badly since the crisis, though it's not as strong a case as Brazil. So I think that the answer to your question is yes, there are ways to do this, but one has to be prepared to implement them, let's say, persistently over time, because institution building takes a long time. Institution destruction can be done quite quickly. Sir.
Hi, I'm not an economist. I'm an engineer, and my question will reveal my economic ignorance. I should just tell you that
Don't rub it in.
I came heavily because I enjoy your interviews on NPR. What are you using? What are the measures of inequality that you're using and the measure of instability?
The measure of inequality it's calculated from grouped data. And the advantage is that grouped data are very readily, widely available. And so, I mean, technically it's the between groups component of Tiles T statistic. So with a hierarchical data set, a data set that is chopped up into consistent groups, you can make a very easy calculation of the dispersion between groups. And that measure, if the data are taken in a consistent way over time or across countries, they are comparable. That is to say that calculations at different times can be compared in a reasonable way. So that's the strength of the approach. It enabled us to mine large amounts of data that were readily available in historical records, in governmental records, and in international agency records, and to make calculations of inequality from that information.
And are you using income as the quantity you're measuring?
That depends upon what the data source is and what problem you're attempting to answer. And you do have to be careful about that. In a large number of cases, we are looking at basically payroll by economic sector or industry, or you're looking at income by geographic region, let's say province, or in the United States you can do it by county, depending upon what the data collection agencies in their infinite wisdom decided they would accumulate.
Okay, and your measurement for instability?
Well, instability is just let's say the variability of motion through time. So that's much more straightforward. Whatever your data series shows, you can calculate a measure of instability. But I don't have I'm not directly computing a measure of inequality and a different measure of instability in order to compare them.
Oh, okay.
You're looking at a single series and asking how unstable it is.
Okay, thank you.
My name is Ming Tong. I, from the pharmaceutical industry, and I would be interested to, look into the, the goods distributions, in terms of the differential pricing of medications. I wonder whether, your model can serve as a help, to estimate or calculate the differential pricing of, different countries. For instance, like, when we selling medication, to Africa versus selling to Canada or sell homeland here, the price would be different. For instance, we may sell $1 a dose, for the anti-HIV drugs to Africa compared to almost like a couple of times more here in the homeland. So along the same direction, I would be interested in, when you calculate the inequality, the fundamental is that using a ratio. For instance, like the Gini coefficient and some other models people prefer in terms of the inequality matrix. I wonder, for a country like Dubai, Abu Dhabi in the Middle East that I pay 2 different independent visits, within the country, the citizen only account for, national account for 17%, and 83% are, foreign employed workers, working in the country. But when you measure the inequality, my concern is that are you measuring within the country, between the national versus non-national, or
No.
within the national or within the non?
The
almost
measure,
like intra
yeah.
and intra.
Yeah,
subject.
it's an important question. The measure that we use for international comparisons is based upon establishments and jobs, and therefore does not distinguish between nationals and immigrant labor. So a country like where you have data for, let's say, Persian Gulf countries, you're going to see a lot of inequality, which is reflecting the employment of people who are not nationals in a lot of occupations. And so I think that's appropriate for looking at the economic structure of the country. If you're looking at what is the relationship, the condition of people who are citizens, then you would want to take a different measure and you'd need a different source.
Right. Yes, I find that, those national, they usually, occupy, very high position.
Yes, of course.
Even, we American, we have some people working there, even your PhDs or economists, biostatisticians, or even medical physicians, the income, never come, close to the national. Maybe they had a master degree and working there, and then you're talking about the wealth or the income distribution. It's
absolutely
too obvious.
I want to be a little cautious too about not claiming too much for what you can learn about, some countries where, let's say, the data are maybe quite partial. Where you have large gray economies, of course, which is true in in many places. You want to take the sources that we use and approach them with at least some degree of caution. I think they are quite reliable for what they show, but all measures have to be evaluated carefully.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Apply differential pricing within the calculation would be very difficult.
Yeah.
Yes. My question is, what about the Occupy movement? There is enormous inequality, and people are responding to it, not within, I would say, when you said, like, lower voting things, I would say that the way that they're approaching the political system is out of the two-party system, but it's not in a non-political way. And it's also designed to affect the outcome. What I mean is the income inequality. It's not there to, I think that's its primary reason. It's not there. It links issues, but I think that's its primary issue. So while I'm an observer of Europe, I'd like you to comment on that, because that seemed the most, it just kept hitting me over and over again on a variety of different ways. You could look at it negatively, that this is a sign of social unrest or thing, or you could look at it from the standpoint of the people who are actually in Occupy, who are going to be the next generation of rulers, and and their need to take back the system.
Well, the book is not written as a comment on the Occupy movement. However, if you look at the back cover, you'll just notice that the author's photo was taken in Zuccotti Park. I do think that we have to face the fact that we have suffered a fundamental failure of our basic institutions. And we are going to be dealing with that for much longer than the economists amongst us, particularly the business forecasters, predicted. You look back on 2009, the standard projection was that we would be near full employment by now, that we would be dealing with an entirely different set of problems. And that was based upon the habit of the post-war period, the habitual thinking, the habitual behavior of the economy, and the notion that nothing fundamental had happened. When it was clear that if you looked at if you just stepped outside of the forecasting frame and looked at the world, that something really dreadful had happened, that we had allowed the financial sector to fly completely out of control and to discredit itself in the world, while at the same time it bankrupted, rendered insolvent a very large part of the American middle class. And these things are not things which are going to be repaired quickly. I moved to Texas 25 years ago in the middle of a big slump. It took 7 years for that regional slump to clear. And we're talking about something much larger now without the rest of the world to pull us out.
Questions?
Thanks. Something you just said prompted me to be wondering about the impact of war. The Second World War seemed to bring with it for whatever reasons, a diminution of inequality, and the result after the war in the United States was opportunity, the much touted sort of building of a middle class. And you may have interesting perspectives on this as well. More recently, after the Clinton years, when there seemed to be a slight decline in income inequality, finally after I don't know how many years, and a budget surplus that we now hear a fair amount about, then there was the launching of the invasion of Iraq by the Bush administration and huge amounts of money spent on this illegal, to my mind, and wrong war. And the question then arises, is it just coincidence whether war is good or bad for inequality, or what is it that was the most recent war part of the story of the recent intensification of inequality, or is it sort of incidental to it?
The Second World War was, as you say, fundamental to restructuring American social, political, financial life. It created a world in which the American middle class had financial reserves, which they did not have in the 1930s. From the 1940s onward, they did, and that was in part because they had earned twice as much as they spent during the war. And so they had the foundation for developing the middle class society that came afterwards. This was really quite a remarkable accomplishment, which will never be repeated because we will never have another conflict of that kind of industrial scale. I mean, all future wars will either be of, and I expect, in fact, that we will not see another one anytime real soon, but because the Iraq experience was such a debacle. But they will either be of that kind, or they will have an element of instant obliteration, which will save us all a lot of trouble. The actual consequences of the Iraq War for the economy were, so far as I can tell, quite transitory. In 2003, 2004, you do see some income differentials develop, and you do see some effects on growth. The income differentials benefit one region of the country over all of the others, and that, guess what, is the counties immediately surrounding Washington, D.C. Right? So you're looking at the effect of government spending. This is quite ironic for a conservative Republican administration, but they were certainly improving the real estate values of one of the densest nest of Democrats in the country. And then that fades out, basically. The phenomenon in the later part of the decade is much more financial sector and the various parts of the country that were being influenced by the housing bubble. Well, again, I think that probably fully answers your question. I don't expect we'll go back into it. We'll see another example of this anytime soon, because it didn't work very well.
Hi, my name is Bernd. I'm an MIT student, and I'm actually from Norway. Mm-hmm. So my point or my question is just, I'm very interested to hear your opinion if you believe that the Scandinavian countries can remain in that position that they are in the years to come. Can they actually keep their position in the world where we regard them as equal societies? Thank you.
Well, there's nothing like having both the Scandinavian social system and a large pool of offshore oil. I fully congratulate you on that. When Governor Perry was momentarily attracting national attention, I'm afraid I got a number of unsolicited calls from the press asking about the Texas economic miracle. And I likewise said that I recommended to all states holding presidential primaries that they develop large pools of oil at a good price. Natural gas, too, is very good. Can the Scandinavian countries hold on to their institutions if they're determined to? I think that's a choice that they will make or not make. And it's not entirely clear to me, given particularly some recent developments, and I think in Sweden notably, whether the political systems of those countries will in fact choose to hold on to the gains and the very interesting institutions of the social democratic era.
Is it possible for a country like ours to reach a tipping point at which income inequality and its power is diffused into other expressions, like the incumbents on the Supreme Court, political elections, super PAC, that sort of thing, so that rolling back inequality is no longer possible?
I'm not going to go that far. I think the situation becomes very complicated when both parties are dominated by a single set of major constituencies in this area and a single resulting ideology. And I think we saw too much continuity in the on the financial sector from Bush to Obama. I think that's very clear. And we failed as a country to come to grips with the need to reform and to downsize the financial sector, which is a massive fixed cost on every other form of economic activity. It's essentially a tax, and you treat these institutions as though they were private, when in fact they are fully supported by the state, and become the kind of dumping grounds for a place into which all other financial institutions are gradually being absorbed. It's a mistake to treat them as essentially a private sector. This is a part of a governing coalition that is causing us enormous damage. I'm not going to say that we'll never arrive at the point where the country can demand and achieve change. It did do so in 1933, and got a lot of benefit out of that. And so I'm hopeful that it will again. But being hopeful and being optimistic are distinct emotions.
Hopefully this is a quick question, but you were saying where inequality might lead to social instability, but I think what in fact we're seeing is, while there is some social instability, aren't we seeing really a rise in state fascism? I mean, and actually seeing an overreaction from the government taking away our constitutional liberties? I mean, that's what I see. You know, everybody's so worried about this inequality thing, when in fact what's happening is we're getting these laws like the NDAA, which totally negates our right to have a fair trial or a lawyer or even charges brought up against us, you know, with indefinite detention planned for American citizens. And where the director of the FBI, when they asked him whether he's allowed to assassinate American citizens, he said he doesn't know. You know, I mean, it just hit, these things just sort of punch at me when I'm listening to you talk. You know, that it's going to lead to social instability. What about the government overreacting to kind of clamp down, actually the government react to lock down the country?
Well, fascism is not a term I use lightly, but I share the anxiety and the belief that we have that we are not protecting our civil liberties and our basic rights and our procedures of justice as we should. I think that's very clear. I would add to your bill of charges the, let's say, forgiveness of torture strikes me as an inexcusable thing. People need to be held to account for these matters, and we will find that the failure to do so costs us in terms of our international standing. It costs us in terms of the respect of the rest of the world, which has much, in many cases, stronger standards than we do in these matters. So, yes, I think that part of a stable self-governing society is one in which certain rules are enforced on the government itself.
Okay, we want to thank our speakers today, Professor James Galbraith and Rachel Wellhausen, as discussing. Thank you for coming.